Today we have two speakers who are going to speak about the same subject, obviously. The title of their talk is What It Means to Belong, Second-Generation Immigrants in France and National Identity. The reason why they're speaking together tonight is that they've worked together on this project for a few years. They've published an article together, and so they're going to also present together, although I'm going to present them separately because they are two different people. So we have here tonight Angéline Escafré-Dublet, who received her PhD in history from Sciences Po in Paris in 2008 with a dissertation entitled Immigration, Culture and the State, the Cultural Dimension of French Immigration Policies, 1958-1991. Angéline has already had a very distinguished career. She's been a visiting fellow at the University of Chicago. She's also been a post-doctoral fellow at the National Institute for Demographic Studies, l'Institut National des Études Démographiques in Paris, and she is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Sciences Po in Paris, where she's a researcher and also teaches the history of immigration. Her work at the intersection of immigration, culture, and politics in Europe, in France, in Europe, and in North America has been published in several major journals. She actually published an article with Patrick in 2009 entitled Représenter la diversité en politique, une reformulation de l'égalité et de la différence par la doxa républicaine, which was published in Raison Politique. She also published in Mouvement and in Histoire politique. Patrick Simon, who is our second speaker tonight, but chronologically is going to be the first, is going to start the evening, the two presentations. Patrick Simon is the Director of Research at INED, at the Institut National d'Études Démographiques, where Angéline was a postdoctoral fellow, and is also a research fellow at the Center for European Studies at Sciences Po. And I would say that today in France is one of the most important voices in the field of international migrations, minorities, and patterns of inclusion and exclusion in France and in Europe. He has acquired this very important status as a scholar of immigration through a series of groundbreaking studies that have combined very rigorous statistical analysis with, I would say, deep and insightful historical and political perspective. So his work is really characterized by interdisciplinarity and by both the mastery of technical dimensions and also more philosophical dimensions. The latest of these groundbreaking studies is the seminal Trajectoire et Origine, Enquête sur la diversité des populations en France, which was published in 2010 and which is, believe it or not, the first encompassing sociological studies of the impact of origin on social studies in France. Other books, and there are many of them, I won't quote all of them, include a collective volume on international migrations in Europe and something that is very dear to me, the Belleville des Juifs Tunisiens. To this, I would like to, or I could, if I had the time, add the countless articles, actually more than 100 articles published in scholarly journals, on immigration, discrimination, and diversity. I can't even quote the list of all the journals that published because that would be very long, so I won't even try to quote all the articles, but it's published in Raison Politique, L'Homme, French Political Culture and Society, Revue Française de Sociologie, Population, Revue Européenne d'Immigration Internationale, Annales de Biographie Historique, and I'm putting the most important one, International Journal of Social Science, Cahier International de Sociologie, and so on and so forth. Patrick has also been a very important voice in the ongoing debate in France on the use of ethnic statistics. I would say he's been, once again, a very important scholarly voice, but also someone who has been intervening in the public arena by publishing tribunes in major newspapers. And he won't speak about this tonight, but obviously we could speak about this during the discussion. And this year, I would say, I would like to add, is a Fulbright fellow and a fellow at the Russell Sage Foundation in New York City. So we're very lucky to have him for the year in New York. As I said at the beginning, Angéline and Patrick have worked together on a European project, on a collective European project on migration and diversity in Europe. which is obviously the basis for the talk tonight. We are very happy to have them at the Maison Française tonight, as I would say representatives of a new generation of scholars, concerned scholars, people who are providing us with rigorous tools in a moment of very, very important debates in France and in Europe over immigration and diversity, and people who are making us stronger in that debate. That's very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Emmanuel, for this very kind presentation of Angéline and myself. We give the paper together because it's a joint paper, and we will do this very strange exercise to split the paper in two. And I will be the first one to speak, and I'll try not to take too much time to leave the second part that will be presented by Angéline on this project. And first, I would like to thank the invitation of the Maison Française of Columbia and Jean-Pierre for being there tonight. It's a nice place to give this paper, which is a work in progress, so that the first time ever that we present this paper. So we're not totally set on it, so we claim for your indulgence to the kind of representation we will do. It's about, so as you see, belongings, a national identity in French, which is these days a very hot debate, and I think you have seen the headlines. Not only there have been an identity disaster, which has been put forward by the government, but it's every day somehow there is a new statement and a new declaration by the Ministry of Interior about Muslim, about what is being French, or what is the position of the place, the situation of the immigrants in the French society. So it's complicated to be up to date about everything that has been said, so I won't touch upon this debate in the news. And as you see, first we will go through a very brief background information on national identity in France, because it's useful to understand the finding that we have. And the two other parts will develop analysis of this survey that Emmanuel has talked about, is the trajectory of origins survey, which has two dimensions. One is a quantitative survey, 22,000 immigrants, second generation, and what those we call the mainstream population in France. So it's a quantitative survey. And the second part is a qualitative survey with interviews on different topics on the selection of response of the quantitative survey, which will be analyzed on the second part by Angéline, who has made the interviews about the narratives of Frenchness. So the idea is to go with the quantitative data about what does it mean to be French, with the very schematic information we gather through quantitative survey, and the second part will be more in-depth understanding how do the respondents define or perceive their Frenchness in relation to the French society. But first, I have to give my source and give our source, and we do also have access to WikiLeaks, like maybe here as well. And we got this sensitive information from the US Embassy about the situation in France that was written in 2005 during the riots that was going on in France. And this statement is quite interesting. It says, the real problem is the failure of the white and Christian France to view their darker Muslim compatriots as real citizens. Cumulative effect has been the creation of a generation of young males lacking parental control and equipped to secure an old job, even though they could break through the formidable barriers of prejudice faced by young Arabs and young blacks in particular. Well, we would not have said that the US Embassy has good sources about the French situation, and we try to see how far this complex of discrimination and racialization has an impact on the way immigrants in second generation will define or perceive themselves as French in the French society. But first, to go on the background, well, you may know that French citizenship is combining two different dimensions, which is very often conflated in one, which is a civic, political dimension of citizenship. The second one, the more cultural one, historical one, which is perceived to be less important in the context of France compared to other countries who would give more emphasis to the cultural dimension. True or not is a matter of discussion. Is really the cultural dimension is not a very important dimension for defining the Frenchness, and we will see that it's maybe not as political as it is claimed to be. And to quote Renan, the daily plebiscite, which is recreation of Frenchness in everyday participation to society, is maybe not exactly what is occurring. What has occurred in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and is not occurring these days in the 21st century France. But still, the French model of integration has been conceived and has been developed to try to create a structure to create unity through uniformity. The main idea, and it's very contrasted with the American way of conceiving immigration and the creation of the nation, is that immigrants may be different when they come, of course, in their new society, but the structure of integration will try to reduce the specificities, the cultural, social, and the visibility of the immigrants in the French society, so that after a generation, so for the second generation, they will simply disappear. Disappear with one dimension, which is the acquisition of the French citizenship. So they become French as a citizen. And secondly, disappearing by simply downplaying the different cultural specificity they would have in their participation in society. So there is a trend with the French model of integration to understand the creation of a French citizen as the contradiction between being a French citizen and being having reference to an ethnic background. So that's the, I would say, the normative model of integration, which has not really ever really worked this way, but it has been recreated this way to understand the way public expression of diversity or differences are perceived to be in contradiction with the real way to be a citizen. And it has been quite influential during one century to produce invisibility after one generation. And one very important tool, which is written here with the statement, this extract from the High Council of Integration in 1991, which I tried to shape the idea of the model of integration quite lately, but tried to define the main dimension of this French model of integration. It says that it is not assimilation, it's not incorporation, it's in between, rights and duties, and well, differences could be tolerated but not emphasized. So it's a sort of a middle way every time, which is complicated to find, but seems to be a middle way. And what is important is to say that the French citizenship should be the parliament of the process of integration. So the idea is that it is an outcome of the process of integration, not the beginning of it, but the end of it. This definition of national identity, of course, has evolved through time. It has been at the core of the debate on immigration, at least for 3 decades. That's been at the core of the debate on immigration at the end of the 19th century. It is, again, at the core of the debate in the last 3 decades, and I will not develop all the different milestones of these debates. But recently, the main idea is that there may be some contradiction between the norms and the values of the mainstream population and those who are put forward by the immigrants and the second generation. So one of the failures of integration is the visibility of these immigrants in second generation and their incapacity perceived by the mainstream population to reach the level of the norms and the values that are expected from the citizen. So the disconnection between the formal citizenship and the political participation and the cultural expectation is maybe at stake in this debate on national identity. One word about the regime of citizenship, which is a bit complicated to grasp, especially from an American perspective. So, it has been set at the end of the 19th century, and from 1989 until today, with a short interruption in 1993 until 1998, there is a sort of a virtual jus soli, which is every child of immigrant born in France is French, virtually French, and will really become French at age 18 years old. So at birth, this child of immigrant is in fact a foreigner, which receives the citizenship of his father or mother, and then it will be automatically French when it comes at age, except if his parents are doing a specific request to acquire citizenship before, but otherwise they are all, almost 95% of them, French when they come at age. So it's a sort of a combination of jus solis and jus sanguinis in this case. And for those who are not born in France, it's a jus sanguinis in the sense that they may acquire French citizenship by applying to naturalization. So it's a discretionary decision by the state, except if you get married to a French citizen, so in this case it's a different pattern, but the naturalization is based on the assessment of assimilation, which is performed by a state agent, which is deciding if the applicant is really reaching the criteria and the requirement for being French. All in all, there are not so many rejections of application. It's only a delay process, which may be a very long one when it comes to applicants who do not have a job or may not speak French fluently and will be refused on this dimension. Anyway, this is the second way to define citizenship. The third way, which is a very complicated history, is how French citizenship has been handled in the colonial territories. So it's a very long story, a very complicated one, depending on the status of these territories. I will not get into that, except to say a very brief statement that there have been a stratified regime, a double standard definition of citizenship, even in Algeria, which was the French department, in which citizenship was granted to the indigenous people with a different meaning of citizenship compared to citizenship that was granted to the Europeans in the same department. So this history of citizenship in the colonial territories may have actually long-lasting consequences on the perception of the citizenship today. And specifically in our case, when we want to identify the second generation of immigrants, it makes it complicated to make the distinction between those who are born, those whose parents are born in Algeria and are, well, the descendants of the former colonizers or French inhabitants of Algeria, and those who are the descendants of the former indigenous second range French citizens from Algeria, which have been, after the independence, granted the Algerian citizenship and have become migrants at this time. So it's very complicated to reconstruct this distinction between the second generation. I have to go very quick on that. So just to materialize how it looks like the categories about French, and it is a census form from 1991, and I'm sure you cannot read anything about that. So this is the last one. It has even not changed in almost 1 century. That's the same question. The question is, you see it, the third question, what is your nationality? And we got 3 different answers. You're French by birth, French by acquisition, or you're a foreigner. And these categories are the ones that are used very frequently to categorize the French population based on citizenship. The very tricky thing is that being born French is not totally understood. And basically, if you go back to the legal definition of being born French, a second generation migrants from foreigner parents should not define itself or herself as a French-born citizen. Is a French by acquisition, which is automatically granted, but still it is an acquisition. Most of the second generation immigrants do define themselves as French-born. So it seems that they are internalizing their perception as being French, like the others, and not making distinction for this virtual dimension of citizenship, which is a very complicated one to understand. And this is another form from the Algerian territory, just to remind you that practices in the mainland territory was not the same one than in the colonial part. And you see the categories. I don't know if you can really read that, but that's the publication of the census in 1931. And you see clearly, in 1936, you see clearly that the categories, which is the meaningful categories, are between Europeans and indigenous. That were the two breakdowns that were used. And the nationality was reused inside the group of the Europeans, which are distinct. The distinction was made between foreigners and French. Okay, so these two curves give you the rate of immigration, which is the blue one, and should be understood with the right bar here. So from the beginning of the 20th century until recently, immigration has rose from 4% to almost 10%, which is a steady increase, but not that big. And from the among the immigrants, the blue line gives you the rate of those who are French. So have French citizenship through acquisition, different types of means. Okay. So you see that the share of French citizens among the immigrants is moving from 15% at the beginning of the century to almost 40% today, which is a really low mark. If you compare to the US, usually about 2/3 of the immigrants are Americans. I mean, take every point in time, maybe not recently with the new increase of immigration post-65, but for a country which defines itself with a very open and very voluntarist definition of citizenship and the expectation that the immigrants should be French, it's quite a low mark. And so now let's keep to the findings from the survey I was talking about, which has been made by the INED and the INSEE together. It's a large team on which we are only two representatives tonight, but more than 20% have contributed to the perception and to the communication of the survey. I'm going very quickly on the description. You don't need that. 22,000 respondents, as I said, between 18 to 60, but more than them are between 18 and 50 years old, so that's the age bracket that we use. And we have, say, 5 different samples: immigrants, second generations, and the mainstream population, and we have a subsample of the people coming from the overseas department who are treated separately. It's complicated to define them as immigrants. Politically, it's not totally acceptable, but they're not really part of the mainstream population as well. So we are trying to, well, you see data, I will treat them as immigrants, even though they're not immigrants, but they're French citizens, they're not coming from a foreign country. So what does it tell us about diversity? You see this very ugly diagram at the right side, which is almost 76% of the population is part of the mainstream population. So what we would call diversity in France today is 24% of the population, which is not very far if you take the US from the rate, from the share of the first generation migrants and the second generation migrants. So very, very comparable situation. I don't describe all the diverse category you can do with this kind of information. And I will skip from the composition of the migrants on the second generation, so about 2.7 millions of immigrants aged 18 to 50 years old, and almost 3.1 million of second generation. And when you see the country where they come from, or the country of the parents the second generation, well, the main groups are the Maghrebians, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, for the first generation. The same for the second generation, except that the Spanish and Italians make a very large share of the second generation, a very small share of the immigrants due to the history of immigration. And so you would find, say, about half of the second generation would be from Maghrebian or Sub-Saharan African background, and the other half would be from European background. Okay? But when we say immigrants, we are somehow conflating two different kinds of immigrants. Those who came as adults, and that's the idea that we have when we talk about immigrants, and those who came quite young with their parents, and they may have a very close situation than those who are second generation. So let's call them generation 1.5, which is not very original, but the usual term used to categorize those who are born abroad but came very early in their childhood to France. Okay, and you see that almost 40% of the immigrants came before the age of 16, which means they are part of their school have been done in France, and part of their socialization have been done in France. So they're not really immigrants as we usually think about it, which is a large share. Same about the second generation. You can think about the distinction between those who do have two immigrant parents and those who do have only one immigrant parent and one French parent. And you see that almost 50% of the second generation do have a French parent. So again, it creates differences, and you see the variation of this with the ethnic background. You would find higher level of mixity for the European second generation and a lower level of mixity for the Maghrebians or the Africans, due to the time span as well of the migration. So let's go very quickly on being French. So this is a description of the citizenship. And I got four categories: French by birth, French by acquisition, which is this category you have seen in the middle. I have added an information about the dual citizenship, which is very less referred to, but which is a very important dimension. And then those who do not have the French citizenship or do have foreigner. And you see, this dual citizenship can make a high level for the second generation. Almost a third of them would define themselves as dual citizens, so having the French citizenship and the citizenship of their parents. So it makes quite a sizable group. And of course, for the immigrants, as we have seen, almost 30% of them are French and 70% are not French, even if you display by the different kind of acquisition. For the generation 1.5, you have a lower number of foreigners and a higher number of French, due to the fact that they came quite early, so they get naturalization easily and quicker than the others. And you see the share of the foreigners for the second generation is pretty small. Only 5% of the second generation do not have the French citizenship. So when you say those who are born in France, they are really automatically French when they come at age. So most of them, 95%, remain French. So that's the general idea. And what you see that when being asked, are you French by birth or French by acquisition, you see that almost 85% say that they are French by birth. They don't say that they are French by acquisition. They don't perceive themselves as French by acquisition. So there is a major discrepancy between the legal definition of citizenship and the individual perception of what is it. So then, second question, you ask a second question: do you feel French? Which is a very straightforward question, which is, well, do you feel totally not? Well, you feel totally, you feel French, or you don't feel French, or totally don't feel French. Well, that was the question. The same was asked about the foreign citizenship, if they do have, or the one of their parents for the second generation. So we call it foreign ethnic feelings. And main information in that, well, as you would expect, the immigrants do not feel French as much as the mainstream population, but still, it's a sizable group. 50% do say that they feel French a lot, which is quite high. Even if you take those who do not have the French citizenship, it's the foreigner column here, 42% of the non-French immigrants do define themselves as French, which means, well, they fit. They live here, so they consider, even if they don't get the nationality, they do define themselves as French as well, which is a very important dimension, I guess. And if you take the orientation toward the country of origin or personal or the one of their parents, again, you have a very high mark. So you would find a sort of combination. It's possible to be French, 19%, and to be Algerian, and 90% as well. So there is a sort of a combination of the two rather than a conflict or contradiction between the two. So there is not an exclusivity of one citizenship against the other. It's a more sort of a syncretism which is created, or hyphenated identity which is created by this question. And what is very striking is that those who are the French citizenship, the immigrants, do perceive themselves, still perceive themselves are very much from their former foreign citizenship. Well, I will skip this one, which is a bit complicated. Just to say one thing is that if you browse this feeling French, feeling foreign, with a very specific country of origin, I think, background, what you would see is that first, there is not a huge variation across groups, so it's a shared position. And secondly, the main variation is observed for the second generation. So there is a decrease of feeling ethnic for the second generation compared to the first one. That's basically the baseline of these findings. And this is even more complicated to get, and I will move very quickly to say that if you combine the information, what you see that this is this yellow on this yellow thing, you see, which is the affirmative identity, and you see that the second generation is increasingly choose an ethnic identity to define themselves compared to the first generation, and it is the main dimension that is chosen by these groups. So we are really facing the emergence of the second affirmative identity. But this is the personal definition of themselves. So how are they perceived by the others? So we don't have a question about a specific third party. How do you perceive this person? But we have a sort of a reflexive question, which is, do you think the others see you as French? That was one question. Do you feel that the others, that was exactly the question was, people see me as a French person, and they were asked to answer totally or not at all, okay, with a gradient. And here, what we see is that a sizable, more, if you take sub-Saharan African, most of 65% of migrants do not think that the others see them as French. And you see the variation could be quite great, and you see that the European groups do perceive more, think that they are perceived French more than the others, and specifically the second generation, which is more or less passive in this case. So it seems that it's not related to the way they perceive themselves, it's more related to the way the other perceive them. So the construction of Frenchness by the mainstream population is not really based on behavior, it's not really based on citizenship, it's based on something else. And what is based, so that's the same category, but this time I take only those who do define themselves as French. And you see that we see the usual suspect, the Maghrebians, the people coming from the overseas department, and those who are coming from sub-Saharan African and Southeast Asian who do not perceive that they are seen as French as much as they do, rather than the Portuguese and the Spanish and Italian who have a different position. And if you try to reconstruct the information, what you see is that somehow we are building almost semi-ethnic racial categories in this case. And if you merge the groups who are very close, you get the blacks, which are the sub-Saharan African and the overseas department, who have a very similar experience. And you get the Maghrebians, Algerian, Moroccan, and Tunisian. And you see and the Asians and the Europeans, that group the Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and the other Europeans together, and you see that it's a striking feature that not being perceived as French, when you define yourself as French, is very similar for all these three groups who are somehow visible in the French society. So it seems that Frenchness is not built on the everyday plebiscite. It's based on how you look like a French person. So it seems that there is an invisible, an implicit definition of Frenchness, which is tied to a more racial definition. So we are moving from belonging to recognition. The key issue about national identity is not how do people perform the French national identity, it's how the mainstream population is able to revise the standard definition of Frenchness. How is it possible to understand, to consider that black or Arabs are part of the French population and the others as French? And it seems that there is a dissonance here between the expectation and the real practices. Even though there are a high level of identities, and even though there is public discourse saying that the problem is not coming from the mainstream society, but more from the immigrants on the second generation who are not performing that. So now I'm leaving Angéline, although it's taking my time, I'm sorry. And we go inside the narratives beyond the figures.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this transition to that the qualitative part of the survey. So we, in this part, I'm going to go a little bit into more details and give you more idea of what it means, that what we're talking about when they say that they don't feel French. So we conducted 26 in-depth interviews. We have 16 men and 10 women, aged from 18 to 50, so that's the Theo survey amongst the population. Also very important, all this population we interviewed are French. They're all over 18-year-old. And during my presentation, I will refer to them with their first name, a first name that is modified. We'll give you the gender, age, and also in this order, the nationality of their father and the nationality of their mother. So in this part, I will show you this what we define were some competing narratives of Frenchness that we think are interacting among second-generation immigrants, and that's their way to belong to national identity. And this is also, we are also going to try to understand how the process of othering of not thinking that you do not look French to the rest of the population operate at the individual level. But first, I would like to raise a methodological point that we were trying to test also with this survey, which is that, so Patrick was touching upon this issue a little bit in his presentation too, which is that when you want to identify a second-generation immigrant in France, you're confronted to all these questions of how do you know that that person is born from foreign parents, basically. That's what defines second-generation immigrants. When they declare, well, my parents were born in Italy, that's pretty simple. But when they declare, well, my parents were born in Algeria. So how do you make a difference in between a person who tells you my parents were born in Algeria? How do you differentiate French expatriates who were born in Algeria from Algerian immigrants? So in the survey, in the census, we have a question about the nationality at birth of these people. So if a person say, well, my father was born French in Algeria, then you may conclude that his father was then an expatriate, what is usually referred to in a French context as a pied noir. However, as Patrick was explaining, the complex feature of the colonial system made that Algerian people actually were also born as were French nationals when they were born. So some interviewee might answer, no, my father was born French, but that person, his father might be, or his mother, might be a French Muslim at the time, so how do you differentiate if they're sons of Algerian immigrants or not? Well, we had another question, which was when Algeria became independent, when that country under colonial rule became independent, did your parents keep their French nationality? In which case you would differentiate in between people who are born out of French expatriates or repatriates from people who are born from immigrant parents. Even at that point, it's not even clear that we're gonna be able to differentiate immigrants from French natives, basically. First, because well, it was possible for some colonial subjects to actually keep French nationality, even though a small number did it. But more importantly, is that, and that's something that we test with these interviews, is that, well, people have a very low understanding of exactly what was at stake, what was going on, what was the nationality of their parents at their birth. What they might have an idea of is the nationality that their parents hold right now, because that has to do with their interaction with them on a daily basis. But other than that, we observe that there are very low level of transmission of the history of the parents, why they arrived in France, why they migrated, and also a very low transmission of what it was to be living in the colonial countries, and also on the part of the sharing of repatriates. They didn't necessarily know all this difference of status that are so complicated. So basically, with this qualitative interviews, we were trying to test if people who answered my parents stayed French when it became independent, whether they were children of immigrants or they were children of repatriates. So we were also testing that, and for that reason, has an important implication for the results I'm going to present, is that we also have in these interviews some people who are French people, born of French people, so members of what we refer to as a majority population. So that also gave us some interesting insight of how they see Frenchness in comparison to the other group, the second generation immigrants group that we looked at. So all of our interviewees, and as I was mentioning, they were also members of the majority, they declare an important feeling of belonging to, and the way they describe it was that it was belonging to the location where they live and their ways of living. They mentioned ways of living often. They were given other options in these questions. We were also asking them that more a question of paper, that more a question of the place where you're born, but they emphasized more the idea that they share ways of living, and I think this can be observed by the recurrence of the word here in their answers. So Hadija, for instance, said, well, I live here, so automatically I have to have French nationality. Selma said, I think French, I studied here, so I want to live here. And Aisha said, I was born here, I went to the same school as the other one, so here it is, I feel French. That feeling of being French is also mirrored by the way they define their feeling when they go abroad, and that's mainly quotes that refer to the experience of being visiting the country of their parents' origin. And so obviously one reason why they would feel foreign in that country is the language aspect. So Jamal would say, in Morocco I feel French simply from a linguistic point of view, referring to the fact that, well, it has an accent when you speak Arabic, when you can speak Arabic at all. But then Selma, for instance, will go a little bit deeper and say, well, in Algeria I'm French. You have another culture, another way to dress, a way to think, to reflect on things. Quite interestingly, in relation to that interview, that also that makes the case, it's important to do qualitative survey, that at the beginning she said, well, when I go to Algeria, no, I'm not French anymore, I'm Algerian, to refer to the fact that she used her Algerian passport because she holds double nationality. But then later on, when she's talking about how it is really to be there, then she has the exact same statement but reversed, saying, in Algeria, I am French. So I think it also showed the importance to also go into more in-depth interview with people to understand how this identity issues are articulated. As for Abdou, who is from Mauritanian and Senegalese parents, he said, well, when I was in Senegal, my uncle told me, people would see just to the way you walk. They will know that you come from France. So I think this gives you a broader idea of what they think makes them different and make them French on a selection of criteria, but also an insistence on this idea that they have ways of being. And I think this way to feel French when they're in the country of their parents mirror the way they think of Frenchness when they are in France. So even if belonging to their parents' country of origin, that sometimes they hold double nationality, that what Benedict Anderson referred to as an imagined community, might be concrete and strong. That identity is not a competing identity with their feeling of being French. It's something that, as we saw, sort of support the result that we saw with the quantitative data, is that this multiple identity are at play in a certain person, and it's not because they feel an attachment to the country of their parents' origin that they do not feel French. However, I appeared a little bit more of figures for you because you were missing them. With this, so we're going back to the quantitative numbers here, and what we can see is that, so if we start by the first question, when they were often asked, are you often asked about your origins? We see that if you look at immigrants, we will group them as blacks, so referring to immigrants from sub-Saharan and from the overseas department. There's a very stable it's trait. They are asked about their origin. Should they be immigrants? Generation 1.5, generation 2, so second generation, and generation 2.5 from mixed parents. So when it comes to the question of origin, if you're a black person, that comes very often, it's stable. When it comes to the Asian population, it's interesting, it's the green line. It drops, but then it increases again. So this idea that even though you are after a few generations, this question is still asked to you. For Maghrebian, it's also the same thing. Basically, the blue line, the last line, below the Europeans, at first when they arrive, they are asked about their origin. They are above the Turks and the Maghrebians. But as you can see, it drops. So when it comes to generation 1.5 and then generation 2, it seems like we were saying, Europeans are pressing. They're pressing for French, and they're not asked about their origins. And then the other questions was, do people perceive you as French? And here again, we see the blue line, the Europeans, it drops after one generation, they think they're perceived as French. Whereas if you look at blacks, Maghrebians, they start above 50% and they stay generation 0.2, they're above 40%. So it's still very consistent, this result, and shows that in a way their Frenchness is denied to them. So we're going to try to see what they mean by this, what Frenchness is then to them. So we try to explore a few solutions, so some cues for this othering, this process of othering that is contradicting their feeling of Frenchness. So first, well, behaving as French doesn't seem to be enough, because Frenchness is also about how you look. So we have Mahmoud here saying, being French is to integrate, because in France you have to be integrated. You have to do everything as French people do, so sort of integrating the norm, this was that is said. However, he goes on, I am not a French person, I am a verb. My face is that of an Arab person. So we have an indication here of the way you look is face, that he thinks identifying as Arab and as not a French person. And Benjamin, whose father, it that's an interesting story too, because his father is Cambodian, his mother is French. His father didn't really brought him up with reference to Cambodia, didn't really learn, taught the language to him, or neither gave him any, neither took him to Cambodia. But he says, well, for me, I have the same culture as them, talking about his friends. But for them, they think I have a different culture. So if that's how people see you, then you can't deny it. It is. You're Asian. And so on paper, parts of Asia that is related to Benjamin is very small. It's his father, and his father migrated to France very early. But in his interaction with the rest of the society, that Asian identity is much stronger, and that comes from his interaction with, in contact with other people. And then what makes you visible then to visibly different to the rest of the French population? Well, here we grouped some of the important features that we thought were coming out of the interviews. First is insistence on physical features. So Rim would say, well, my complexion is very dark, so people can tell right away I'm a foreign. Je suis une étrangère, she said. Je suis étrangère, sorry. Then Khadija said, well, sometimes when one has French nationality, it's not enough. Depends on your face also. As for Abdou, who, as we saw earlier, was the one who people could take was French just the way he was talking in the markets, he said, well, a French person who is not questioned whether he or she is French is a French person who is white and has a French name. He doesn't say that he was said that he wasn't French, but that's what his ideas of what he heard and what he thinks is spread among the people he interacts with. So that's for physical features, but we also have an important element with religion. So Selma said, well, I radiate something that is not French, something that is Muslim. And interestingly, in that part of the interview, I was doing the interview, and so we come about this question of Frenchness, and she told to me at that point, and I couldn't see it before, that she's veiled when she's outside. But since I was interviewing her in her living room, and I'm a woman myself, she wasn't wearing the veil. But when it comes to talking about how you look French to the rest of people, she mentioned the fact that she was wearing a veil, and then that's what she means by I radiate something that is not French. And she said immediately afterwards, well, I feel French, but she also articulated this idea that if you look Muslim, you do not look French. Kader, it's a different story because he doesn't think he's practicing, he's not a religious, he's not religious, there you go. He said, well, it's my surname. I'm seen more as a Muslim, and he was sort of contesting this because he doesn't think it's an identity that he belongs to. But those were the features that they express were making them look different. Also, yeah, interestingly, this sort of standard of Frenchness, how does a French person look, extend abroad? And so Jamel said, well, if I'm abroad and I say I'm French, people often say, oh, you do not look like a French person. And his father is Moroccan and his mother is Algerian. So, also, that importance of what people, the interaction with the rest of the population is important, and what reinforces also it, I think, we think, and also the question of discrimination is an important element in the TEO survey, even though we didn't really develop on this here. But so we had several questions on that, and yeah, we think that the experience of being discriminated also reinforced that feeling. So we had Johan, whose father is Senegalese and whose mother is French, who said, well, you feel French until you're asked for your paper. So, being asked for your paper at the moment where it can be it's very discriminatory. He was walking with friends there who were white, and he was the only one who asked paper. It was during the day in downtown Paris. So that's how he articulated and expressed this identity control. Also quite typical of the experience of discrimination too is also to downplay that aspect. So Laurence, for instance, whose father is Beninese and mother is French, said, I think people see me as a person of color, but I'm very discreet. I'm not someone who makes troubles. And as a counterexample of that, we had Stéphane, who we interviewed also to check why he answered his father was born French, in a former French colony, so he's part of the mainstream community. And here we have an example of someone who did not experience discrimination, and for this reason feel much more at ease to articulate some foreign origins. And so we say, well, people do not know that I have French origins if I don't tell them. So he's white. I like to mention that I have foreign origins. It's a way to set myself apart from people who are too focused on being French natives. It's a way for me to say that I'm French, but I have a certain way to approach different cultures. So I think this very different reading of ethnicity in French context also gives some interesting counterexample of the other discourses that we had. So in conclusion, we have these competing narratives of Frenchness that are articulated by second-generation immigrants that are in response to the society and reinforced by experience of discrimination. But we also think that it comes from the fact that there's an absence of representation of diversity in national narrative. And this racial construction of Frenchness are also further supported by the construction of a national narrative that is a little inclusive of French colonial and immigration past, and also ask them if they identified with French history, for instance, and the fact that these elements are not really part of how the history of France is presented also can play an important role in explaining this competing narratives of Frenchness that are interacting among this second generation immigrants in France. Well, thank you for your attention, and we're looking forward to your questions.
So thank you very much for two great presentations that obviously were very well integrated together, and I'm sure will be the basis for lots of questions. I'd like to start with a question that is maybe not, maybe a little tough question. That's a question that I've had to face myself with my own work, because I've also worked on race in France. And basically what you're doing here is to say, race matters. Race does matter in France. We knew it. And from an American perspective, that's something that I've had to encounter presenting my own work. What? Okay, so what? We knew that, French are racist. French people are racist. So, what do you bring to that? First of all, how do you answer that? And what do you bring to the conversation? So, in a way, my second question is, why does it matter that, even though French are racist, the fact that they thought that they were not racist, what was the effect of, the denial of race and racism, of this, colorblindness, even if it was, an hypocrisy, even if it was real, did it have some, real effect on how people were thinking they were living together? So that this kind of work does matter at the end of the day. Okay, I'm sorry, this is a big question.
So what question?
Yes. No, I mean, maybe someone else wants to.
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks so much for the discussion. What a deep conversation, there's a lot to sort of unpack and think about. So obviously I'm Black, and we're having a frank discussion about conversation. About the race and ethnicity. And I sort of always thought of France as being sort of this sort of beacon of racial tolerance. You know the history of African Americans going to France and being accepted and being embraced. And so having known that, and then sort of seeing firsthand that, you've got a lot of Arabs, a lot of Blacks, who are second generation immigrants, et cetera, who don't feel French. You talked about this, who don't feel that the society, has embraced them, who don't feel it's an opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. So this is incredibly, this confirms what I knew before, sort of anecdotally, but it makes me even more sad for the society as a whole, particularly because I am very proud to be American. I love France, I'm a Francophile, but I'm very proud to be American. I don't see that as competing ideas. So I guess that's the comment, and I guess the question sort of piggybacks on what you said. So what are your thoughts? What is the future of French society and cohesion like? It doesn't seem positive. It seems very sort of pessimistic in a way. I don't know.
So more on the so what question before we go into more specifics, or
Yeah,
yes?
more on the so what question. And this tails into your question. You think it would have made a difference if Mitterrand had had a more integrated policy in terms of these problems?
Mitterrand.
Especially Mitterrand.
The 80s.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, another question.
I have a question for clarification. Thanks. First, so if I understood you correctly, your basic argument is a lot of these people didn't feel French, but they're not perceived French because of color. What you said is a little bit what I also thought would be stronger in the survey, namely all the reports about, for example, young French people in banlieue or wherever who say, I don't like France, and so on. So perhaps you can clarify that.
Okay, so we're having a lot of heavy questions at the same time. So two more heavy questions here, and then we're going to let.
My question is somewhat linked up with that question. That I also like to hear. What is your explanation, in fact, that people who are so discriminated against nevertheless want to feel or feel so much French? Because it is a very puzzling result, in fact. People are horribly treated, but nevertheless they are proud to be French. And we did more or less the same research in the Netherlands. And part of the answer might be, in fact, that we have to better look into what it is when they say that they are French, or when they say that they feel at home in France. And I think that question must also be asked at the Census. When we looked into the Netherlands, at least, it showed that they didn't identify so much with the national level. It was far more like something vague, or the local level, or the regional level. So I'm wondering, what does it say? Did we really say there's no problem with national identity? Or is national identity itself really wide? We nevertheless feel French, but not in a strong sense of a national identity, but more vaguely, indeed, as you say, location, where they live, where they work. And that is not the same as national identity, I would say.
One last question for this round.
Yeah, so you point right away to something about race. Could there still be other factors at play, for instance, religion also, which could be a separate issue?
Mm-hmm. That's a complication. We will go two to the presentation, two for the answers. Okay, so maybe to begin with the so what question. Well, of course, you may say that it's not a surprise. It comes with no surprise that there is racism in France, and you could be labeled through your, not only race, but the ethnic background, which is wider than race. And it's not a surprise that it plays a role in defining the national identity. But still, I think one of the consequences of the, I would say, the national myth, the French national myth, is that it is not expected that you could be very easily and quietly combining ethnicity from French ethnicity and another. So being affiliated is not perceived as sort of open identity in the public sphere. So there is a sort of a competing legacy behind that, which is if you define yourself as French, it is against the heritage you received by your family or the kind of references you would put forward from the history of your parents or different kind of ethnicity that would be built as well in the history of your trajectory in France. And one of the consequences is that it's still a very assimilationist perspective, which is a requirement to be detached from these legacies. And I think it's still at play today when the debate, national debate on national identity is simply saying that, which is you're too visibly not French. It's not based on the practices or the references, even though the debate on Islam may somehow take this direction. But it's more general than that. It is the French model of integration seems to be deficient so far that it's it seems that there were sort of a closeness between the groups that were supposed to integrate. And the discourse is based on culture, which is a fake one. It's not a matter of culture, it's a matter of being invisible. And this time, the new second generation is not invisible than the former second generation from the Polish, the Italian, the Spanish has been. And like the second generation Portuguese is today, even though the Portuguese has migrated exactly at the same time and even a bit after the Algerians. But it's not a matter of time. It's a matter of how do you build yourself with some cues that refer that you're not really part of this representation of France as, well, I don't know how to define it, a white society maybe? Or maybe it's something else, but it's not simply, as a contrast I would say, the fact that these sub-Saharan Africans, the Maghrebians and the Caribbeans are not perceived as French as the others, even though the Caribbeans are French for than 10 generations. It's simply a signal that there is an implicit representation of Frenchness which is not tied to the participation of society. It's something else. So I think it's not clear that it is perceived in the French debate. I'm not sure about that. And I'm more than that sure about the opposite, which is, well, wait a bit. This generation is going to be replaced by the third generation, and then they will be educated as the others, they will have less discrimination, they will get into the French crucible, and they will become invisible that the others have been invisible somehow. It's not the case, because they won't be invisible, so we have to understand that the French model of integration has to change, because the statement it has does not fit with the situation. That's it. So that's somehow the so what point, which is to be able to give two pictures. One is it's not an issue, and I'm not sure about the question you asked about the fact that they refuse to be French because they are discriminated against. They don't. They don't see exactly the consequence of defining themselves as French as a reaction against discrimination. There is not a direct relative identity against Frenchness that would say, well, you don't like us, we don't like you. It's not like this. I mean, there is a strong, and somehow it's, for this reason, the French model of integration is very powerful, that it creates a trend, a dynamic towards incorporation of the French identity. It works. It works, clearly. But it does work so far. I mean, the part of the immigrants of the second generation is down. The part of the receiving society is not down. So it's a betrayal. You play the game, but the game is not the one you think it has to be played. So this is the discontent we are facing now. So, and what will be?
Yeah, I was going to answer the question about do they feel French. So yeah, just to clarify, they feel French. That's what I was showing at the beginning. They kept saying I feel French because of this or that. So we try to give some content of what it is to feel French. That's what I was explaining when they say, well, I live here, I studied here, and so on. So very importantly, it's not that they don't feel French, it's that they feel that a French person is not a person who looks like them. Also, in the situation of the interviewer that we were can be interesting. In at least in one situation, one interviewee opposed himself to me. Said, if you talking to me, if you apply, they will take Angéline, but they will not take Mohamed. So they clearly put the divide in between white French, like the WikiLeaks explained. And also, I think a long frustration that I could see in some interviews, frustration of being asked, do you feel French? They do not like this question. I was in a long interview with a woman who didn't, anytime I was trying to head to this question of Frenchness, really understood the question if I was asking her if she felt French. That was not the question I was asking. I was asking her what it is for you to be French. And later on in the interview, at some point, she said, "Oh, but it's always like that. You ask people of origin." And then I said, "No. In my sample, I have people who are of not origin." She said, "Oh, you really asked them the question?" I said, "Yeah, I asked the question." "Oh," and I said, "Because the question that I ask is what it is for you to be French." And he said, oh, then I can answer this question. So yeah, there's a tension about that, about asking second generation, do you feel French? I think related to the way the migrants were presented in the media, definitely this idea that they were presented as disloyal to French identity, all the fact that is made about the fact that they support a soccer team that are from their parents' country of origin. But that's not something that we say. I mean, that topic we brought up, but that's part of the fact that they still feel strongly by attached to the country of their parents. But has nothing to do with the fact that they feel French. So, yeah, I think an important point to make that was very consistent in the interview that they felt French. It was more that it was in the experience and the eyes of the other that were changing. And just to answer the question about religion at this point, well, first there would be an argument that would say that religion in colonial context, maybe in the post-colonial context, have been also racialized. So that could be taking part to that same dynamic. But yeah, we try to differentiate a little bit. Yeah, I think it's two variables that can play. Sometimes interacting people are black and Muslim. Sometimes you can dissociate them, and it's different experiences. That was definitely what we kind of conclude on that racial divide and sort of color line. But yeah, the religious aspect, the story of the woman who was veiled, I'm sure is also a very important feature. Maybe
I had something about religion and one statement about the history of Mitterrand. About the religion, we have the question about identity, which is a very interesting one, in which we ask for people to generate 4 dimensions of their identity, giving a list, a long list of 50 items, right? Gender, age, sexual orientation, color, region, hobbies, family situation, and religion in it. And I was very struck by the fact that religion has not been picked by a lot of people. It was not mentioned. So even by the people who define themselves as Catholic or Muslim, it's not the way they will define having to choose in 4 different their identity. So it seems it's not perceived as a clear identity marker. And it's contrasting with the debate, which say that, of course, Islam is everywhere in the debate, in everyday news, and I would assume most of the people are, as we have seen in some of the quotes, and we have seen that being perceived as Muslim as a consequence on your social life. So it seems that there is a discrepancy between the way you perceive yourself, where you define yourself with a religious term, and the way the society is building the image of the Muslim. And I would expect that the same survey, maybe in 10 years' time, would have different findings. That is, the self-perception as Muslim will increase so far that the debate is creating the Muslim identity as a very silent identity in everyday life. So maybe we have done it in 2008. It was already there, but not maybe as much as it is year after years. I don't know how it will look like. And the second question about the 80s and Mitterrand, what would have been the future if the Socialist Party and Mitterrand in the 80s had done a different integration policy? I think it would have been very different. I do think. I think what we have seen there have been 2 years, in 83, 84, and then 85, during which a first attempt to amend, to revise the national model of integration, the discourse about the French society as a multicultural society have been used. And for 2 years it has been said, French is a multicultural society. So immigrants are there to stay, they got second generation, they live among us, so now the standard, the representation of society has to change. And what happened? So the Marche des Beurs, so the civil rights movement in 83, 84, and then suddenly the National Front, so the right extreme, has made an upsurge in 84. And so at the same time that there are this civil rights movement, there is a huge nativist reaction, which is, well, French is not the way you talk about it, which is already also the case these last 2 months, when we have clear statement by the government saying that France is not, should be the one you found, you should be France the way you find it when you came in. So don't touch it. Which is exactly the expectation of the National Front, which is should not change. So I think the consequence of the National Front in the 80s has been to freeze probably the debate about how to revise the representation of French society. And we have now, 20 years ago, after that, still struggling with the same problem to try to, well, recognize the fact that it's a diverse society and it has consequences on the way you define national identity, which is now found in the way our respondents testify of their experience.
More questions on Anne?
First of all, I just wanted to thank you for a really interesting and informative presentation. I'm particularly interested in the categories that we construct, and so I was very interested in your decision to group your findings along these racial groupings effectively. And so I wanted to ask you, was that a subject of contention among your team of researchers? Also, to what extent has that raised objections among, communities in France to which you present this work? And then also, I think that there's a curious asymmetry in the categories that you use, because you use blacks, I'm assuming noir in French, for people of African descent, but you don't talk about whites. Instead, you talk about Europeans. And I'm interested to know why you've got that asymmetry in your labeling. So, yeah.
Oh, I thought you were going to answer that. I was very impressed by this. Have you interviewed any of these people you interviewed? Were they interviewed also according to socioeconomic differences, if they were bourgeoisie, working class, this sort of thing? And also among French people, which you just referred to, the nativists, the concept of France as terre de paix, and all of this, there's a big conflict, obviously, with this, the theory and practice today. Among French people, would you say it varies among, I would say it would, among social classes? Who would be more prejudiced? Would it be working class people, upper class people, bourgeoisie, or something like that? I think there would be big differences.
It's interesting to see, the two sides and how they relate to each other. And there's this massive quantitative study, and then there's a sort of relatively small qualitative study. And I was interested more in the diversity within that qualitative study. Even identity and ethnic identity tends to be really salient when people are younger. And most of the people whose quotations you used were in their 20s. I think there were 2 who were 30. I'm sort of interested in, people are older, further along in the life course, do they have different sort of ideas of the salience of their ethnic identity? And then a second sort of short question, which sort of piggybacks on your question, is that one slide which looked at ethnic descriptions, right? If people are asked if they're French, and it seemed to be steady, especially for blacks. Couldn't there be a second interpretation of that by saying that people actually move out of more insular, immigrant communities into, more diverse communities, and so they actually are asked more often about their, about their origins because of that. There might be sort of 2 conflicting.
Thank you for your presentation. So my question relates to the last questions. So in terms of socioeconomic status, I was interested in how, not in terms of the French, but in terms of the second generation, if there's variation in terms of how they perceive their visibility or their experiences with discrimination based on socioeconomic status, and then also in terms of, I was wondering if there were differences in gender, and whether those kind of symbolically mediate the ways in which they perceive their visibility or their experiences with discrimination.
Can you be more specific about what needs to change? Can you, I know it's not what you're here to do, but if Sarkozy was to have a task force and it was politically possible to do this, what would need to change in the education system and social services, things like that, in order to have a more accepting concept of citizenship?
It's kind of a
to say it's kind of science fiction because Sarkozy would not be interested.
Okay, actually, my question relates to related to yours. You mentioned the fact that maybe more inclusion of immigration history or colonial history into the national history would help. And my question is, how efficient would that be?
So we are going to give you some time to answer. The second Salma. We have more questions.
Okay. So for the categorization, it's a tricky question. It's a very ad hoc process, and it's not a stable one. So the choice to qualify the category is still under discussion, and maybe it was an attempt to see how significant findings we have when we reconstruct the categories. Not using one of my problems that when we give this paper in the US is that as you see we have almost 10 different country of origin, group of country of origin. So divided by 2 generations, it makes 20. So every time that you have a table, you have 20 information. Assume, I mean, you're used to that, so you don't even think about it. But usually in the US, you have 4 categories, which make it very simple to get the differences. And of course, it's a very schematic one, and has to be challenged. But in our case, we come from this legacy, which is a very important one, because of course, each country of immigration has its own history, and when you come from Portugal, it's not the same thing as coming from Spain, even though you may be perceived exactly the same way by the mainstream population. And what I'm struck by, because I'm used to use, and I'm a pure fan of describing immigrants with a very specific history of migration, because I assume it's a very important point. But what I must admit is having worked on this huge data set, the findings are very, very strikingly put together Portuguese, Italian, and Spanish, regardless of the specific history they have, and produce a very similar pattern, and a very similar pattern for sub-Saharan African, and somehow overseas Caribbeans who I would not expect it to be close to the sub-Saharan African are, in some respect, not in all, but in some. So after a certain time, you are finding this very recurring findings. You just feel that it seems something has to be meant by that. So that was my. So then, okay, saying European are not white is an important thing. It's because it's really what bridges them is that they come from Europe, and if they would be bridged with the mainstream population, I would say white. But in this case, they are separate because they are the mainstream population is not part of the analysis of most of the data you have seen there. This rather, whether we should be a white category, I think it would be meaningful, would be problematic. As a black one, I mean, it's as problematic as a black one. I don't mean that it's easier in your case. My experience is that it's a very ironical thing. When I give papers in France about race and ethnic statistics, and I talk about blacks, and most of the question, and I talk about whites as well, using white as a terminology. Most of the question of the people in the audience is, what is a white? Nobody asks, what is a black? So that it goes without saying, I mean, there is a common understanding, even though you don't like the category, I mean, you don't try to see who is behind the category. But when it comes to whites, because people do identify more, I mean, the audience is predominantly white. Not always, but predominantly. And the reaction is on the white category, because people do project themselves and just, am I white? And so it seems that because the terminology does not exist in France, it's not an easy way to grasp it. So, well, anyway, I'm not sure that this category is going to be used extensively in the near future. I'm not sure about it. I don't know. We'll see. Second question about the social class dimension, which is a very important one. it's not part of this presentation, but all the findings that we have, all the analysis have always tried to control by social class and education, which is a very important dimension. And when it comes to discrimination in the work, this is one of my very surprise as well, that, and it's even not the direction I was expecting. The most significant part of the education on ACS is that the high level of ACS and the high level of education are more discriminating against than the others. So you would expect that it's a working class issue, which is you are more perceived as black when you're working class and less when you climb the social ladder. But in fact, it seems that's for the identity, because the identity doesn't change at all the social class. Right? It's not significant. Definitely, when it comes to the identity, most of the analysis we have done, we don't find significant impact of social class on this. On discrimination, we have a significant one, which is those who have a university degree do declare themselves more discriminating against than the others. And if we shift to a less subjective indicator, which is how many situations of discrimination have been through, which is not asking the questionnaire using the word discrimination. It's a descriptive thing. In education, on labor market, which is, have you been refused a promotion? It's not self-discriminating against. And all these questions, which are very descriptive, give exactly the same result. Those who are highly educated have more situations of discrimination than the others. So it seems that when you try to break the glass ceiling, you face discrimination more than when you are remaining at the position you're expected to be, below. So maybe you're prejudiced, but you're not discriminated against because you don't get out of your place.
Okay, just as a follow-up on the category of white, so I think it's often, I remember actually last year when someone said, mentioned the fact that he didn't know what to cross, when you go to the US, you have to cross Caucasian. I think it's also, to even go a little bit further, is to say that there's a difficulty to acknowledge that you're white and that it's in the normative category and that you're part of the majority and your position also of power. I think there's a difficult acknowledgement of this that is already playing a role there. The question on age and their change over the course of life, it's an interesting question that actually we'd like to deepen a little bit. But my impression with the interviews was that closer to the experience of school, that the normative discourse about French citizenship as being civic. It's an important part of the teaching. It's taught in civic instruction as part of the history and geography classes from when you're in secondary school and high school. So it depends, of course, the kind of the way it was introduced by the professors, but it's an important part of what is taught about what it is to be French. And I think the closer they are from this teaching, the more they articulate this understanding of Frenchness as civic, and yeah, it's a little bit counterintuitive here, because you could think that when you're still part of your family, you're more identifying with countries of your parents' origin. But I thought it was more this idea that Frenchness is as a civic sense that was expressed, and it's a little bit more. When people are more around their late 30s and have been in contact with the context of work and been assigned to their origin in different circumstances, that maybe they'll articulate a little bit more this sort of ethnic ascription. So because of the discrimination experience that we're talking about, and because school is not often identified as a place of discrimination, whereas other experiences in life are more. It plays a role in the way they declare a sense of Frenchness. So yeah, I think there's a generational change, but this would need to be further developed. As for the question on colonial history, it's debatable. Since it's not introduced yet, it's hard to know. Yeah, I've been thinking about this recently because they introduced immigration history in the history program in secondary school. So now it's going to be a chapter that is going to be taught, and it's been a debate, and it's been a strong, strong change that a lot of people have been asking for. But it's true that we don't know if that will really change people's perception. It also depends on how it's going to be taught, what they're going to be, they're going to remember of it. So this is something you can ask for, but as for really knowing what its impact will be, it's debatable, especially since I know that some experiments have been done in the US about that. So like the teaching of Black history, does that decrease, for instance, feeling of racism, and it's not something to take for granted. But what we can say is that we need to have more historians working on colonial history in France in any case. So that should be claimed.
Okay. There was one more question.
Yeah, the questions that you asked were of people being interviewed were, do you feel French or something along those lines? If people were first generation, second generation immigrants, I wonder whether they really interpreted that question as being, do I feel like I have the right to be in France? You know, whether they turned the question into something else in their heads before answering, based on their own immigration history or the immigration history of their parents.
They were not asked if they felt French. They were asked what it is for them to feel French.
No, but that's the narrative that in the quantitative survey. It's complicated to tell exactly how to be interpret the question. Right? I mean, that's one of the problems of quantitative survey, that you ask a question, you have, as a conceptor of the question, one idea behind the question, but the question is received by a large number of different persons who may give different meanings to that. So we try to reduce the variation of meanings, but still, I cannot be totally sure that the question which was, do you feel French, has been really understood in the same way by everybody in Europe. Due to the fact that, as we have seen, the national identity is in debate for a long time now. In France, I do think there is not so much ambiguity about the meaning of it. It's really portrayed every time, and a lot of discussion around it. So I would expect that they do receive the meaning of feeling French in a very comparable way to each other. But maybe there could be some interpretation behind that. And all the questions could be with double meaning sometimes. We try to go with that.
Yeah, I've already answered, but I had two quick seconds. Yeah, so the first one was for the folks that were asking questions, were there any representations of any Arabs or Arab French folks or Black French folks? Because I just wonder how maybe the answers might have been different. One, and then I guess the other question I sort of had, sort of thinking about was, and this is completely anecdotal, I get a sense that there's generally more la mixité in France, and it's more common for whites to date blacks and vice versa, and have friends, like intimate friends of a different race. And so it just seems very strange to me that this is even a problem, because I've always sort of seen that was more the case there than here.
Yeah, it's a very important point, and you made it before about the racial tolerance made by the African Americans who came in the 20s and have been perceived. I've found a society which seemed to be less racialized and less divided on racial lines than the US at the same time, which was true. One complicated story behind this specific experience of the jazz men and others who came, African American who came in the interwar period, that they were not only black, they were Americans. So they were outliers in all respects. And they were arriving in a society in which blacks were a totally exotic thing, which is exotic population we were external to the French society, that is, in the colonies. So it seemed that it was not matching with the representation of the French society. So they were somehow out of the system. I will not take that as information on the degree of racial pervasiveness at the same time. But
can I say something too? If they were also musical performers, that's not the same as the accountant, the teacher, the doctor. A musical performer or a dancer is already, they give spectacles and people applaud, but you don't necessarily take them home with you. You know, so that's also a different.
At the same time, there is some historical account on the colonial troops that were in France during the First World War and stayed sometimes before that, and there were conflictual, not only conflictual relation, because one of the problem for the French government with the Algerian troops were that they getting married in the French mainland territory, and they tried to prevent that, even though there were not an explicit anti-miscegenation. To say that, I don't know if the meaning of it I don't like, or it's simply the English pronunciation. But anyway, there were not a strict law against mixed marriage at this time, but well, of course, social perception were not totally open to this mixed marriage. So it comes to my second point. In the findings, we haven't seen that there from the survey. Is that I'm totally impressed by the fact that we find consistent findings that show that there is racial segregation in housing, in neighborhoods, racial segregation on the labor market. So there is racial lines that shaping the labor market, but not and the intimate relation. The level of mixed marriage are quite high. So it seems that there is two different societies. One society is organizing access to power, resources, and position, social position. In this case, there is strictly racial lines, not only advertised, but can be seen by these kind of findings. But when it comes to the interaction, due to the fact that there has not been this historical institutionalized boundary between races or groups, I think it's easier to be in a more intimate, not only the most intimate one, which is mating with somebody from another group, but also in everyday life. So it seems that the interaction on everyday life is possible, and it goes back to the marriage, where the structure of the society is divided. I think that's what we should understand on the long run to revise our conceptions. So that's a very positive, because we are looking for a positive vision for the future. And I don't know if it's something to say to Sarkozy. I think one of the changes are coming from the bottom. The multiple society is created at the bottom. So far, it is possible. It's still to have access widely to society. I'm more concerned not by the fact that there is ghettoization. I'm more concerned by the fact that there is not an equivalent access to supermarket. The fact that you got gatekeepers who are in line on supermarkets in most of the suburbs, and they prevent young kids from blacks and Arabs background to get in because they just suspect that they're gonna steal something or make problems. And so open access to society and to the paramount place of society, which is consumption, is not authorized, and it's following racial lines. And I think it's the most devastating boundary which is created in the French society, not only in the French society, which is channeling the use of public transportation, channeling the use of consumption, not with specific laws preventing people to do in this and this space, but that everyday practices. And it's even done by gatekeepers who are blacks and Arabs. We are simply following the prejudice and the stereotype that are in circulation in society. So that's the more darker position for the evolution of French society. So just to conclude on the Saturday thing, Sarkozy has begun his mandate by taking very firm statement on the diversity, on the need to try to reduce discrimination and to enhance diversity in France. It seems he has changed his mind, clearly. And even more that this discourse has now been followed by a concrete change in policy making, even the reverse. Policy making has getting in a more stigmatization direction, so there is a sort of a bigger discourse in this case. And more than that, I think that my point is that it's not only a change in the school system or the change in the organization of society in a very concrete way, it's also a change in the more symbolic dimension, which has not been done. And if you compare with the Dutch society, I mean, the move, even if it's, you can talk a lot about the move in the Dutch society, about the multicultural dimension or perception of the Dutch society, but that is not more or less been done in the late 70s, beginning of the 80s. Even it was purely symbolic and not really entailing access to equality in the Dutch society. It was at least changing the representation of society. Well, it's controversial today, but it has been an attempt for some years. It has not been done in France. I mean, we still have a strong assimilationist perception, and the definition of Westerners is still based on a very narrow perception of what does it mean to be French. That's what we try to summarize with the findings, and I think this is the core of the evolution that has tried to be done in the 80s, have failed, and it's still on the table today, and it's not what is appearing.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Are you directing your work specifically towards effectuating change in this area? Are you involved in this, or is it mostly just for public awareness that, or it's education that you're doing?
Well, if I see my social responsibility as a researcher is to try to reduce stereotypes and the communism and the situation of immigrants and second generations. That's one part, and the second one is try to make it easier to move towards a more multicultural society. Because I think it creates more coherence in what is the French reality today and what is the way to organize a society which is facing this kind of composition of its population and its history. That's my personal perspective.
On this note, we shall end, and thank you very much.